My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and I recently finished up a video series debunking CinemaSins, everything wrong with the Lord of the Rings movies videos. And so now that I've defended the Lord of the Rings movies, I have to balance it out a little bit by criticizing them, because I do have my criticisms, and they actually missed a lot of things in CinemaSins that really are perfectly good criticisms. And I'm not going to be criticizing the movies in this particular video series in terms of cinema sins. I'm going to be actually looking specifically at plot changes that were introduced by Peter Jackson that created inconsistencies or incoherencies in the plot. And I can't really find a way to explain that briefly without giving away where we're going, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. And in this particular video, I'm going to be focusing on the Fellowship of the Ring. Eventually, I'll do additional videos on the Two Towers and the Return of the King. But let's go ahead and get started with the Fellowship. So the first change I want to talk about is Aragorn's character in all three movies, really, but especially in the first two, and even more predominantly in the first one, the Fellowship of the Ring. Peter Jackson has Aragorn not want to become king, which is very much the opposite of the case in the novel. In the novel, Aragorn wants to become king, A, because it's kind of his lineage, it's his destiny in a sense, and because Elrond straight up tells him, you don't get to marry my daughter unless you're the king of Gondor and Arnor, because I'm not going to let her go for anything less. Now, of course, they also, kind of as a result of all this, changed the plot in the movie as well, such that Arwen is now planned to sail west because Aragorn wants her to leave and doesn't want her to stay in Middle-earth and become mortal. Arwen, of course, doesn't like this. There's just all kinds of weird stuff they changed that doesn't really fit the book very well. But one of the interesting things that this does, in the novel, because Aragorn is perfectly in line with becoming king, he wants to do that, he does get the sword Narsil reforged before he ever leaves Rivendell. And as a result, he carries Andúril around with him for the entire story, other than, from Bree to Rivendell, basically. So, as a result of this, what happens in many cases, none of these result in really contradictory things, but they do result in some weird situations. One of the things that gets left out is in the Two Towers, which Aragorn, when they arrive at the Golden Hall in Edoras to meet Theoden, Aragorn doesn't want to give up his sword. That's just kind of a nice little vignette that gets left out because there's no reason for it in the movies. But more importantly, in the Fellowship of the Ring, what I think is the most significant alteration that happens here is the fact that in Lothlorien, when everybody else is getting some kind of gift from Galadriel, they don't give Aragorn anything. I mean, Celeborn gives him a knife, but that doesn't count. That's not one of the gifts that Galadriel is giving to everybody else, so that doesn't fly. So, Galadriel gives gifts to the hobbits, all four of them, gives a gift to Legolas, gives a gift to Gimli, although oddly enough she doesn't give anything to Boromir either. I don't know why exactly they left him out. Anyway, point being, in the novel, Galadriel was supposed to have given Aragorn a sheath for his sword, and one of the interesting things about that is she says that the sword drawn from that sheath would not be broken in battle, even in defeat. It gives you kind of an Arthurian legend vibe, because in Arthurian legend you have the sword Excalibur, and the sheath that goes with it, if it's also carried with the sword, prevents the possessor from being killed in battle. So a little less impressive perhaps than Excalibur's sheath, but still gives you that kind of vibe. So the fact that we get to Lothlorien, Aragorn, who is well known to Galadriel, well known to basically everybody there, and he doesn't get any kind of gift from Galadriel. I mean, she tells him in the movie, I have no gift greater to give than the one you already bear, the Even Star. It doesn't make any sense. Everybody else is getting something. even though Sam only gets rope and Merry and Pippin only get, little knives. Like I said, Celeborn does give Aragorn a knife, but it's not part of the same thing, so it doesn't really count. So this whole deal of Aragorn not wanting to become king, it really changes the nature of the scene, and it's completely unnecessary. And it also ends up wasting a lot of time in terms of screen time, because there's just a lot going on about Aragorn not wanting to become king, all his, oh, I'm so conflicted and all this. But to me, this scene is the biggest one. Now that's just kind of a taste of what's to come, because the next couple really they create some serious issues. So let's look at those. So the next plot change I want to talk about is Gandalf related to Moria. In the movie, what we see is Gandalf knows that there's something really dangerous in Moria. He doesn't want to go in there. Gimli's the only one who really cares to go into Moria. Gandalf wants to try to go over the mountain pass of Caradhras. A few of the other people, well, originally they planned to go through the Gap of Rohan, which makes no sense. Everybody knows, or should know by this point, and does in the novel, that the Gap of Rohan is not going to work, because that's where Isengard is and Saruman is going to be watching. In the movie, they act like the flock of Crabine that fly overhead is the first indication they have that they really can't make it through the Gap of Rohan. I mean, really? Come on, that doesn't make any sense. So that's one thing that's just kind of weird. But the other thing is, in the novel, what happens is Aragorn is the one who wants to go over Caradhras. Gandalf is the one who wants to go through Moria. Both have been through Moria before. Aragorn doesn't want to go back through. Gandalf doesn't like the idea, but he thinks it's their best chance because, A, it takes them out of the view of basically anybody. There's no way they're going to be spotted by Sauron's spies or Saruman's. And it also is kind of a shortcut in the sense that it's hard to get over the mountains, less hard to get through the mountains, since there's actually kind of a city already built for you. He does, of course, recognize the danger, because Moria is it's a place where orcs are known to have lived and possibly still do live, and also Durin's Bane, and we all know what Durin's Bane is. It's the Balrog. So he knows that these are risks, but he thinks that they can make it through as long as they're stealthy. So in the movie, on the other hand, he doesn't want to go through Moria. Now, why does this create a contradiction or issue with the plot? Well, later on, when we get to Lothlorien, we get the interchange between, Galadriel and the Fellowship, and one of the things that Legolas says is that Gandalf fell to both shadow and flame, for we went needlessly into the net of Moria. Galadriel replies, "Needless were none of the deeds of Gandalf in life. We do not yet know his full purpose." Now, this is a really weird line in the movie, because what does she mean, needless were none of the deeds of Gandalf? It's a response to what Legolas just said about going into Moria. Going into Moria was not Gandalf's decision in the movie. In the movie, Gandalf basically leaves the decision up to Frodo once they reach an impasse on the mountains, and Gimli is again trying to get them to go through Moria, and Frodo chooses to go through the mines, not really having a clue what he's asking for. Whereas in the novel, there's more discussion of it, and there's, people who are making the decisions know what their real options are. That's another thing that this plot change creates in terms of problems, is the whole issue of why would you let Frodo choose? In my video on why the CinemaSins take on this is wrong, you could argue that Gandalf is sort of leaving the decision up to Frodo as a way of leaving it up to fate, and that is true. On the other hand, it does seem like kind of a bad idea to leave it up to Frodo and not even tell him any of the implications. So back to the real problem, though. Galadriel says that needless were none of the deeds of Gandalf in life. This makes so much more sense in the novel, because in the novel it was Gandalf's deed or decision to go into Moria. And so Galadriel is saying, yes, it seems like it was a really stupid move now, but that doesn't mean it actually was. We may find out later that there was, something more substantial to this. And of course, if you think about it, that makes sense. If Pippin hadn't been a fool of a took and, made a bunch of noise in that well in the chamber, then they probably would have made it out of Moria without a hitch and wouldn't have been a problem. So, even on that level, it would have made, Gandalf's decision made sense. And on the other level, it still makes sense because Gandalf does get sent back as Gandalf the White, and that makes a lot of difference as well. But in the movie, the line doesn't really make any sense because Galadriel is basically saying Gandalf's deeds were not needless, but which deed is she talking about? The only thing she could be talking about in response to Legolas is going into Moria, which was not his decision. So what is she talking about? It doesn't make any sense. So that's why that one doesn't work, in my opinion, and why that was and it doesn't, there was no need for that plot change either. There's no reason Gandalf couldn't have been the one that was willing to go through Moria and have Aragorn still be the one that's like, no, let's go over the mountain pass. There was no reason to make that change. So, again, I think that was just a really bad move on Peter Jackson's part. Now let's hit the final one that I want to talk about, and it's also related to Moria. So, the other point related to Moria is the fact that Gimli, the entire time, is basically assuming that Balin is running Moria, that it's going to be a perfectly, safe trip, and there's going to be no issues. Now, this creates several problems. First of all, we are living in the universe where the dwarves were kicked out of Moria a long time ago by orcs and a Balrog. Gimli should know that. Now, that's not really made clear in the movie, so that by itself doesn't really create a plot contradiction or anything like that. And again, this is an area where CinemaSins, if you go back and watch my video on their video on the Fellowship of the Ring, they almost found a real problem. And I pointed out there that their argument was Gimli should have known about everybody in Moria being dead because they had clearly been dead a long time when you see the skeletons strewn about the room and whatnot. I pointed out there that's not necessarily true. I mean, there might have been reasons why they wouldn't have heard from them, but not necessarily reasons why they would have heard that they were all dead or something to that effect. You could even imagine, and I should have mentioned this in that video, that they were all skeletons because the orcs ate their flesh, because orcs have a tendency to do that. So there's, they could have been dead much more recently than you'd think. Regardless, the point here is the dwarves who went to Moria with Balin knew that they were running a risk in the novel, and in the novel what happens is the dwarves from Erebor, including Gimli and Glóin, show up because they have not heard from the Moria dwarves in a long time, and they want to get Elrond's advice, and also because they've had a Black Rider come up to their gate offering a dwarven ring in exchange for the ring that Bilbo had. They're getting all this at one time, and it's kind of creepy, and they go to Elrond for advice. Gimli then goes off with the Fellowship, of course, and he's aware that Moria is quite possibly not safe, but he still wants to go because it is the land of his forefathers. So, in the movie, however, he's all gung-ho and thinks Balin is for sure still alive, and he's just expecting basically a red carpet welcome. This creates a problem because not only does it not acknowledge the fact that Moria is a dangerous place, which again is not per se a contradiction within the confines of the movie itself, but it creates a problem because he and Gandalf have polar opposite views on Moria, and they never discuss it. It's like Gimli thinks it's going to be just a walk in the park because Balin's obviously running the place, and what's to fear? Gandalf is obviously mortally afraid. Neither of them really ever discuss it. Why not? I mean, did it never occur to either of them to think, wait, what are you thinking? Don't you know X? Whereas, and then the other would be like, well, no, don't you know why? I mean, Gimli ought to be like, why are you so afraid, Gandalf? And Gandalf ought to be, don't you know there's a Balrog in there? And yet, there's no discussion of it. It makes no sense. You've got these two characters who have radically different views about what Moria is going to be like, to the point that one thinks it's going to be the easiest part of their trip, and the other thinks that it's possibly the deadliest part of their trip, and they never talk about it. You would think something like that, when deciding which route to take, would be something that would come up and they would actually discuss. Instead, it never really gets brought up, never gets mentioned. Nobody ever discusses the possible implications of going through Moria at any point in the movie. And again, that's the real problem with leaving it up to Frodo. It's one thing to let Frodo decide. It's quite another thing to give the decision to Frodo and not tell him anything about what his decision might entail. See, that's where CinemaSins messes up. It's like they almost hit, an actual problem, but they missed the real problem that they thought they were identifying. So, again, it just strikes me as really weird. When you watch the movie the first time, you probably don't catch it, but then when you think about it, it's like, why haven't Gimli and Gandalf hashed this out before? I mean, they've only been traveling for a long time. They're trying to get through, they're talking about going through Moria, and they don't ever really consider why the other has an opposite view. They don't ask. It doesn't make any sense. So, anyway, those are, to me, the top 3 plot changes in the Fellowship of the Ring that really messed up further plot later on. There are probably some others, but they're not as significant in terms of creating like inconsistencies. So that'll do for now. So those are some completely unnecessary changes Peter Jackson made to the plot that resulted in some weird or inconsistent aspects in the movies. Hope you enjoyed that. I plan to do one for The Two Towers and The Return of the King as well. I'm actually rewatching the movie trilogy to kind of pull out elements that I think create these issues, and I haven't gotten through all of it yet, but it is interesting to go back and look at it from that angle, because the eye of a critic is not one that comes naturally to me, at least in that way. I can spot changes between the book and the movie, obviously, but finding the implications is not always as easy. So it's an interesting exercise. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a like, share the video around. Please also subscribe if you want to learn more about Tolkien and the worlds he created, or even Tolkien in other non-Middle-earth related contexts. And you can also follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.